Ruqayya knew the desert like the back of her hand. The sun, harsh on others, was a familiar warmth on her brown skin. Her hands, calloused from years of tending goats and sheep, moved with practiced ease as she guided her flock across the shifting sands. She knew the taste of sand in her teeth, the sting of a sandstorm, the quiet rustle of a desert fox in the night. Ruqayya spoke little, but her eyes held the wisdom of the desert, a place of stark beauty and constant challenge. She had survived flash floods and bandit raids, her strength not in words, but in action. One scorching afternoon, a dust cloud announced the arrival of traders. Her father, burdened by debt, had made a difficult decision. Ruqayya was to be sold. She felt a pang of sadness, but accepted her fate with her usual quiet resilience. The traders, impressed by her sturdy frame and knowledge of animals, paid a good price. Ruqayya, clutching a small woven bag containing her few possessions, climbed onto the back of a camel and left the only life she had ever known. The journey was long and arduous. Days bled into nights under the relentless sun and starlit sky. Finally, they reached the city, a sprawling oasis of stone and vibrant color, a stark contrast to the endless expanse of sand. Ruqayya, used to the open desert, felt a strange mix of awe and apprehension. The traders led her through bustling markets and narrow alleyways until they arrived at a magnificent palace. Its walls, made of smooth white stone, seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Intricate carvings adorned the archways, and the air was thick with the unfamiliar scent of flowers and spices. Ruqayya, in her simple, worn clothes, felt like a pebble amidst jewels. She was ushered through a grand entrance into a courtyard, filled with lush greenery and a sparkling fountain. Servants dressed in fine silks hurried past, their voices hushed and respectful. Everything about the palace felt alien to Ruqayya. The polished marble floors were cold beneath her sandaled feet. The air, heavy with perfume, made her head spin. This was a world of luxury and refinement, a world she had never imagined. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and fascination. She was a shepherdess in a world of silk, a servant, distracted by gossip, mistakenly directed Ruqayya through a carved wooden door. Ruqayya, shouldering a heavy sack of camel feed, found herself in a large, opulent room. Silk cushions were scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and rosewater. Women, dressed in brightly colored silks and adorned with jewels, reclined on the cushions, laughing and talking. This was the harem, the women's quarters of the palace. Ruqayya, dusty and sweat-stained from her journey, stood awkwardly in the doorway, the sack of feed slumping against her shoulder. The laughter in the room died down. The women stared at her, their eyes widening in surprise and amusement. One by one, giggles erupted, then full-blown laughter. They pointed at her calloused hands, her simple clothes, the coarse sack she carried. Ruqayya, unflinching, met their gaze. She had faced sandstorms and wild animals. The laughter of these pampered women held no fear for her. Just then, a tall, powerfully built man entered the room. He wore simple desert robes, his face weathered by the sun and wind. This was Sheikh the ruler of the land. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the scene. He noticed the women's amusement. Then his gaze settled. On Ruqayya, he saw not a clumsy servant girl, but a woman who stood tall and proud amidst their mockery. Her steady gaze, her quiet dignity, intrigued him. "You," he said, his voice deep and commanding. Ruqayya met his eyes, a flicker of surprise in her own. "Follow me." He turned and strode out of the room, not waiting to see if she obeyed. Ruqayya, without hesitation, followed. The laughter of the women faded behind her as she walked through the maze of corridors, the sack of feed still heavy on her shoulder. Idran led her not deeper into the palace, but towards the back, where the sounds of animals replaced the whispers of the harem. He stopped outside the stables, the smell of hay and dung a familiar comfort to Ruqayya. "This camel," Idran said, gesturing towards a dromedary lying listlessly in the straw, "is dying. Can you help it?" His voice was blunt, devoid of the flowery language of the harem. He valued action, not empty words. Ruqayya nodded, setting down the sack of feed. This was a language she understood, the language of camels and the desert. Ruqayya knelt beside the camel, her hands gently exploring its swollen belly. She spoke softly to the animal, a low murmur of reassurance. The camel, sensing her calm presence, stirred slightly. Ruqayya opened the sack of feed and pulled out a handful of dates, offering them to the camel. The animal nuzzled her hand, taking the dates with a weak groan. Idran watched in silence, impressed by her confident movements and the gentle authority she held over the animal. He had consulted his finest physicians, yet none could diagnose the camel's ailment. This simple shepherdess, however, seemed to understand the creature instinctively. Ruqayya examined the camel's eyes, its gums, the way it breathed. She then mixed a concoction of herbs and water from a pouch she carried in her woven bag. With practiced ease, she coaxed the camel to drink the mixture. "It has eaten something poisonous," she said, her voice clear and direct. "A desert flower, perhaps, hidden amongst the grass." Idran nodded, surprised by her quick diagnosis. The physicians spoke of fevers and infections, but none mentioned poison. Ruqayya shrugged. "They see sickness in the body. I see it in the eyes, in the way it moves." She continued to tend to the camel, cleaning its wounds and applying a soothing balm. Idran remained by her side, asking questions about her life in the desert, her knowledge of animals. He learned of her solitary existence, her battles with sandstorms and predators, her deep connection to the land. He found her practicality and resilience refreshing, a stark contrast to the artificiality of the harem. The women laughed. "At you," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of anger. Ruqayya looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Their laughter is like the desert wind," she replied. "It blows, but it does not harm." Idran smiled, a rare sight. He appreciated her straightforwardness, her lack of pretense. He too found the constant flattery and intrigues of the palace tiresome. He longed for the simplicity of the desert, the honesty of the open sky. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the stable yard, the camel stirred again, its breathing becoming more regular. Ruqayya stroked its neck, a gentle smile on her face. "It will live," she said. Idran felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the camel's recovery, but for the quiet strength of the woman before him. He had found a rare gem in the rough, a woman who valued action over words, a woman who understood the language of the desert, the language of camels, a language he himself spoke fluently. Days turned into weeks, and Ruqayya slowly adjusted to the rhythms of palace life. She learned to navigate the maze of corridors, to distinguish between the different silks and spices, to understand the hushed whispers and subtle gestures of the harem women. A servant showed her how to properly address the sheikh and the other members of the household. She was given new clothes, soft robes of cotton and linen, a welcome change from her rough desert garb. Yet, despite the comforts of the palace, Ruqayya felt a deep sense of isolation. The other women, with their painted faces and elaborate hairstyles, seemed to belong to a different world. Their conversations, filled with gossip and courtly intrigue, held no interest for her. She missed the open sky, the feel of the wind. On her face, the familiar bleating of her flock. She found solace in the stables, amongst the horses and camels. She spent her free time tending to the animals, grooming their coats, whispering secrets to them in the language of the desert. The animals, in turn, seemed to sense her loneliness and offered her a silent companionship. Idran, too, found himself drawn to the stables. He would often seek out Ruqayya, asking for her opinion on the health of the animals, or simply to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the court. Their conversations were brief, stolen moments amidst the bustling palace life, but they held a depth that was missing from his interactions with others. He admired her quiet strength, her unwavering honesty, her deep connection to the natural world. He would watch her as she moved amongst the animals, her hands gentle yet firm, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of the desert. He saw a beauty that went beyond the superficial adornments of the harem women, a beauty that resided in her spirit, in her resilience, in her unwavering connection to the land he ruled. Ruqayya, in turn, found herself looking forward to these brief encounters. She felt a strange sense of peace in his presence, a sense of belonging she had not felt since leaving her desert home. His direct gaze, his quiet respect, made her feel seen, not as a lowly servant, but as a woman worthy of his attention. Their bond deepened, not through grand gestures or flowery declarations, but through shared silences, stolen glances, and the quiet whispers of the desert that echoed in their hearts. It was a connection forged in the simplicity of the stables, amidst the scent of hay and dung, a world away from the perfumed air and silken whispers of the harem. Sibyl, the head concubine, watched from the shadows of the harem, her eyes narrowed, her lips pursed in a thin line. She had observed the growing closeness between Idran and Ruqayya with a mounting sense of unease. Idran, usually aloof and distant, seemed to seek out the shepherdess's company, his face softening in her presence. This simple, unadorned woman, with her calloused hands and quiet demeanor, posed a threat to Sibyl's position, a threat she could not ignore. Sibyl had long enjoyed Idran's favor. She had learned to anticipate his moods, to cater to his whims, to weave a web of comfort and familiarity around him. She had used her beauty, her charm, and her subtle manipulations to maintain her influence over him. But Ruqayya, with her unassuming presence and her genuine connection to Idran, represented something different, something real, something Sibyl could not replicate. One afternoon, as Ruqayya was tending to the palace gardens, Sibyl approached. Her movements graceful, her smile dazzling. She wore a flowing robe of emerald silk, her dark hair adorned with jewels, her fragrance a heady mix of exotic flowers. Ruqayya, in her simple linen dress, felt a pang of self-consciousness. "You are Ruqayya, are you not?" Sibyl asked, her voice smooth as honey. "The shepherdess who saved the Sheikh's camel?" Ruqayya nodded, surprised by the head. Concubine's attention. "I have heard so much about you," Sibyl continued, her smile widening. "Your skills with animals are truly remarkable. The Sheikh speaks highly of you." Ruqayya lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond to such praise. She had grown accustomed to the disdain of the harem women, not their compliments. "I wanted to welcome you to the palace," Sibyl said, extending a delicate hand towards Ruqayya. "I hope you will find happiness here." Ruqayya hesitantly took Sibyl's hand, surprised by its softness. The jewels on Sibyl's fingers glittered in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the calluses on Ruqayya's own. "The palace can be a confusing place," Sibyl continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But if you ever need anything, please do not hesitate to ask me. I would be happy to help you navigate the complexities of harem life." Ruqayya nodded again, a feeling of unease settling in her stomach. Sibyl's words were kind, but her eyes held a coldness that belied her sweet smile. Ruqayya had learned to trust her instincts, honed by years of surviving in the desert. And her instincts told her that the head concubine's kindness was a mask, concealing something far less welcoming. The fragrance of intrigue hung heavy in the air, a subtle poison masked by the sweet scent of flowers. Sibyl's smile vanished as soon as Ruqayya was out of sight. The head concubine's eyes glittered with a cold determination. she would not allow this desert girl to steal Idran's affections. She would weave a web of deceit so subtle, so insidious, that Ruqayya would be banished from the palace before she even knew what had struck her. Cybele began her campaign with small, seemingly insignificant acts of sabotage. She smeared grease on the saddles, ensuring that Ruqayya would be blamed when Idran's horse slipped. She loosened the ropes securing the camels, causing a minor stampede in the stable yard. She mixed sand into the horses' feed, making them ill and irritable. She then began to spread rumors, whispering to the other harem women about Ruqayya's incompetence, her clumsiness, her lack of understanding of palace etiquette. She hinted that Ruqayya was using her knowledge of animals to gain favor with the Sheikh, suggesting that her motives were less than pure. The other women, eager for gossip and easily swayed by Cybele's charm and influence, readily accepted her version of events. They began to avoid Ruqayya, whispering behind their hands whenever she entered a room. They snickered at her simple clothes, her calloused hands, her quiet demeanor. Ruqayya, oblivious to Cybele's machinations, continued to tend to the animals. With her usual dedication, she noticed the subtle changes in the stables, the misplaced equipment, the agitated animals, the whispers of the other servants. But she dismissed them as simple mistakes or coincidences. She was too focused on her work, too connected to the animals, to notice the serpent slithering through the garden of the palace, poisoning everything it touched. Idran, preoccupied with tribal matters and negotiations with neighboring sheikhs, remained unaware of the brewing conflict in his own household. He was spending long hours in council meetings, poring over maps and treaties, his mind consumed with matters of state. He trusted Cybele to manage the affairs of the harem, unaware of the poison she was slowly dripping into the heart of his palace. He still sought out Ruqayya occasionally, finding respite in her quiet presence, but his visits became less frequent, his conversations shorter. He was too distracted, too burdened by his responsibilities to notice the subtle changes in Ruqayya's demeanor, the flicker of sadness in her eyes, the growing sense of isolation that was slowly enveloping her. The seeds of doubt, planted by Cybele, were beginning to take root, slowly but surely poisoning the fragile trust that had blossomed between the sheikh and the shepherdess. The council chamber was stifling, the air thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of voices. Idran sat on his ornate throne, his face impassive, listening to the elders' debate. They spoke of alliances and treaties, of land and resources, their words weaving a complex tapestry of political strategy. The central theme, however, revolved around a single issue: Idran's marriage. The daughter of Sheikh Omar would bring a valuable alliance, one elder argued, his voice raspy with age. Her lands are fertile, her family powerful. Such a union would strengthen our position in the region. The Princess Fatima is known for her beauty and intelligence, another elder added. She would be a fitting consort for our sheikh. Idran remained silent, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne. He understood the logic of their arguments. A strategic marriage would bring stability and prosperity to his people. But the thought of marrying a woman he did not know, a woman chosen for him based on political expediency, filled him with a sense of unease. His thoughts drifted to Ruqayya, her quiet strength, her unwavering honesty, her deep connection to the land. He remembered the way her hands felt as she tended to his injured camel, the way her eyes held the wisdom of the desert, the way her simple presence brought him a sense of peace he had not felt before. He knew that a union with Ruqayya would be unconventional, even scandalous. She was a slave, a shepherdess, a woman who knew nothing of courtly manners or political intrigue. The elders would never approve. The harem would be in an uproar. Yet the thought of marrying anyone else, of sharing his life with a woman who did not understand him, who did not share his values, filled him with a profound sense of emptiness. He was torn between his duty to his people and the stirrings of his own heart. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him, heavy as the desert sands. He was a sheikh, a leader, a symbol of strength and stability. His personal desires had to be secondary to the needs of his tribe. The elders continued their debate, their voices rising and falling, their words like grains of sand swirling around him, blurring his vision, suffocating him. He felt trapped, caught between the expectations of his position and the longings of his own soul. The sands of doubt shifted beneath his feet, threatening to engulf him in a storm of uncertainty. Cybele, sensing Idren's growing uncertainty, decided to escalate her campaign against Ruqayya. She knew that a single dramatic incident would be more effective than a series of minor mishaps. She waited for the perfect opportunity, patiently, weaving her web of deceit. One evening, as Idren was preparing to ride out to inspect the outlying villages, he discovered that his favorite stallion was lame. The stable master, intimidated by Cybele's veiled threats, claimed that Ruqayya had neglected to properly shoe the horse, causing it to injure its leg. Idren, already burdened by the pressures of leadership and the elders' insistence on a strategic marriage, felt a surge of anger. He had trusted Ruqayya, had seen her skill with animals, and yet here was evidence of her negligence. He strode towards the stables, his face grim, his steps heavy. He found Ruqayya tending to a sick foal, her hands gentle as she cleaned its wounds. She looked up as he approached, a flicker of hope in her eyes, quickly replaced by apprehension as she saw the anger etched on his face. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. "Did you neglect my stallion?" Ruqayya stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, my sheikh," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I shod the stallion myself just yesterday. I checked his legs carefully. There was no sign of injury." Idren, however, was already convinced of her guilt. The stable master's words, combined with the mounting pressure he was facing from all sides, had clouded his judgment. He wanted to believe Ruqayya, but the evidence seemed irrefutable. "Do not lie to me," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "The stable master saw you. He said you were careless, that you rushed the job." Ruqayya's heart sank. She knew that she was being framed, but she had no proof, no way to defend herself against Cybele's insidious plot. She looked at Idren, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. He had trusted her, had seen her competence, and yet he was now accusing her of negligence, of betrayal. "I would never harm any animal, my sheikh," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You know that." Idren turned away, unable to meet her gaze. He wanted to believe her, but the seeds of doubt, planted by Cybele, had taken root, poisoning his trust. He strode out of the stables without another word, leaving Ruqayya standing alone, the weight of his accusation heavy on her shoulders. The sting of betrayal cut deep. She had faced sandstorms and bandits, had survived the harsh realities of the desert, but this, the loss of Idren's trust, felt like the cruelest blow of all. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, a single drop of salt water in the vast ocean of her despair. He had distanced himself, his warmth replaced by a cold indifference, leaving her feeling heartbroken and alone in the opulent prison of the palace. Ruqayya, though heartbroken, refused to be defeated. The desert had taught her resilience, the ability to rise from the harshest of storms. She would not let Cybele's lies destroy her. She would find a way to clear her name and expose the head concubine's treachery. She began to spend more time with the other palace servants, the ones who worked in the kitchens, the gardens, and the laundry rooms. They were simple folk like herself, far removed from the intrigues of the harem. They had witnessed Sibel's manipulative tactics firsthand, and sensing Ruqayyah's genuine kindness, they began to confide in her. A young kitchen maid, Fatima, told Ruqayyah how Sibel had spread rumors about her stealing food from the pantry, resulting in Fatima's demotion. An older gardener, Omar, revealed how Sibel had blamed him for a withered rosebush, a prized possession of the Sheikh's late mother, leading to Omar's public reprimand. These stories, whispered in hushed tones in the quiet corners of the palace, painted a clear picture of Sibel's manipulative nature. She used her position of power to control and intimidate those beneath her, weaving a web of lies and deceit to maintain her influence. Ruqayyah realized that she was not alone. Sibel had hurt many others, using the same tactics to discredit and silence them. This realization, while painful, also gave Ruqayyah a renewed sense of purpose. She would not only clear her own name, but would also expose Sibel's cruelty and bring justice to those she had wronged. She began to gather evidence, meticulously documenting every instance of sabotage, every whispered rumor, every act of intimidation. She spoke to the stable boys, who confirmed that they had seen Sibel tampering with the horses' feed and loosening the ropes securing the camels. She found traces of grease on the saddles, carefully preserving them as evidence. She collected the wilted rosebush from the garden, noting the unnatural way it had withered, suggesting poison rather than neglect. She moved with caution, knowing that Sibel was powerful and cunning. She confided in no one within the harem, trusting only the other servants, the ones who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out against the head concubine. Ruqayyah, like a desert rose blooming in the harshest of environments, began to reclaim her strength. She would not be broken. She would fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered under Sibel's tyranny. The desert had taught her to survive, to endure, to rise from the ashes, and that is precisely what she intended to do. Ruqayyah sought out Zahra, the oldest servant in the palace. Zahra had served 3 generations of sheikhs and had witnessed countless intrigues unfold within the harem walls. Her face, etched with wrinkles, held the wisdom of a lifetime spent observing the ebb and flow of power. Ruqayyah found her in the palace laundry, her hands gnarled but nimble as she folded freshly laundered linens. Hesitantly, Ruqayyah shared her suspicions about Sibel, recounting the incidents of sabotage and the whispers she had gathered from the other servants. Zahra listened patiently, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "Sibel is like the desert viper," Zahra said, her voice low and gravelly. "Beautiful to look at, but deadly if provoked. She has wrapped the sheikh in her coils, using her charm and her cunning to maintain her hold on him." Ruqayyah nodded, her heart heavy. She had seen the power Sibel wielded, the fear she instilled in the other women. "But even the viper has a weakness," Zahra continued, her eyes glinting with a hint of mischief. "She fears exposure. She fears losing her position, her influence over the sheikh." Ruqayyah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Zahra smiled, a knowing smile that spoke volumes. "The sheikh is a just man. He values honesty and loyalty above all else. If he knew the truth about Sibel's treachery, he would act swiftly and decisively." "But how can I prove it?" Ruqayyah asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "She is clever. She leaves no trace of her misdeeds." Zahra chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like the desert wind. "Patience, child, patience. The desert teaches us that even the smallest grains of sand can shift the landscape. We must wait for the right moment, for the wind to blow in our favor." Zahra advised Ruqayyah to continue gathering evidence, to document every incident, no matter how small. She taught her the subtle ways of the harem, how to read the unspoken language of gestures and glances, how to discern truth from falsehood in the whispers that circulated through the palace walls. She explained the complex power dynamics at play, the alliances and rivalries that existed between the different concubines and servants. She showed Ruqayya how to use this knowledge to her advantage, how to play the game without becoming a pawn in someone else's scheme. "The Sheikh trusts you, child," Zara said, her voice firm. "He sees your honesty, your strength, but he is blinded by Sibyl's charm, by the web of deceit she has woven around him. We must find a way to open his eyes, to show him the truth." Ruqayya listened intently, absorbing Zara's wisdom like a parched desert flower absorbing the first drops of rain. She began to understand the complexities of the harem, the subtle nuances of power, the importance of patience and strategy. A plan began to form in her mind, a plan to expose Sibyl's treachery and reclaim her place in the Sheikh's heart. The whispers of the desert wind, once a lament of despair, now carried a message of hope, a promise of justice, a whisper of the storm that was gathering on the horizon. A strange stillness settled over the palace. The air, usually thick with the scent of flowers and spices, became dry and heavy. The vibrant colors of the gardens seemed to fade, replaced by a muted, dusty hue. The birds, normally chirping merrily in the courtyard, fell silent. Even the whispers of the harem women seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. Ruqayya, standing in the stable yard, felt a prickle of unease. She looked towards the horizon, her eyes narrowed against the glare of the setting sun. A dark, swirling mass was forming in the distance, a monstrous cloud of sand rising from the desert floor like a vengeful djinn. A sandstorm, and a fierce one at that, was heading straight for the palace. Ruqayya's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the destructive power of these storms, the way they could bury entire villages beneath mountains of sand, the way they could choke the life out of anything caught in their path. She had to act quickly. The animals needed to be secured, protected from the fury of the approaching storm. She called out to the stable boys, her voice sharp and urgent. "A sandstorm is coming! We must secure the horses and camels. Bring extra ropes and blankets. We have little time." The boys, startled by her urgency, sprang into action. They led the animals into the deepest part of the stables, securing them with thick ropes and covering them with blankets to protect them from the sand and wind. Ruqayya moved amongst them, her hands firm and efficient, her voice calm and reassuring, directing their efforts, ensuring that every animal was safe. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Sibyl remained oblivious to the approaching danger. She was too preoccupied with her own schemes, too focused on plotting Ruqayya's downfall to notice the ominous signs. She was meeting with the other concubines, whispering her poison into their ears, fanning the flames of jealousy and resentment. "The Sheikh is spending more and more time with that desert girl," she hissed, her eyes glittering with malice. "He is neglecting his duties, forgetting his place. We must do something to remind him of his responsibilities, to show him the error of his ways." The other women, swayed by her words, nodded in agreement. They were blinded by their own envy, their own desire for the Sheikh's attention, unable to see the danger that was gathering just beyond the palace walls. They continued their plotting, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves, oblivious to the roar of the approaching storm. Ruqayya, having secured the animals, stood at the edge of the stable yard, watching the storm approach. The sky had turned a sickly yellow, the air thick with dust. The wind howled, whipping the sand into a frenzy, creating swirling vortexes that danced across the desert floor. The roar of the storm grew louder, closer, a terrifying symphony of nature's fury. She knew that she had done all she could to protect the animals. Now she could only wait and pray that the storm would pass quickly, leaving minimal destruction in its wake. She glanced towards the palace, a flicker of concern in her eyes. Were they prepared for the storm? Did they even know it was coming? She had a feeling a deep, unsettling feeling that the storm that was about to engulf the palace was far more dangerous than any they had ever encountered before. The sandstorm hit with the force of a battering ram. The palace walls groaned under the onslaught of wind and sand. The sky turned a swirling vortex of brown, obliterating the sun. Visibility dropped to near zero. The air became thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe. Inside the harem, panic erupted. The women screamed, their voices lost in the roar of the wind. They stumbled around blindly, their fine silks whipping around them like tattered flags. Cybele, her carefully crafted composure shattered, shrieked. Orders? Her voice barely audible above the din. In her fear and confusion, she led the women out into the open courtyard, believing it to be the safest place. Ruqayya, watching from the relative shelter of the stables, saw the women emerge into the courtyard, their brightly colored robes now ghostly figures against the swirling brown backdrop. She knew that they were in grave danger. The open courtyard offered no protection from the wind and sand. They would be choked by the dust, blinded by the swirling sand, perhaps even buried alive. Without hesitation, Ruqayya ran towards them, battling against the ferocious wind, her shepherd's cloak billowing behind her like a sail. She reached the courtyard, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the storm. "Follow me to the stables quickly!" The women, disoriented and terrified, hesitated. Cybele, her face contorted with fear, shrieked, "No, stay here, it's safer here." Ruqayya grabbed Cybele's arm, her grip firm. "The courtyard is a death trap. The stables are our only hope. Follow me." The urgency in Ruqayya's voice, the strength in her grip, finally broke through Cybele's panic. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The other women, seeing Cybele's acquiescence, followed Ruqayya, stumbling and gasping through the swirling sand, clinging to each other for support. Ruqayya led them into the stables, the relative calm, a stark contrast to the raging storm. Outside, the animals, sensing the fear of the women, shifted uneasily in their stalls. Ruqayya quickly closed the heavy wooden doors, shutting out the worst of the wind and sand. The air inside the stables was still thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe. Ruqayya took off her thick shepherd's cloak, a heavy, woven garment designed to protect her from the harsh desert elements. She soaked it in water from a nearby trough and hung it across the entrance to the stables, creating a makeshift air filter. The damp cloth trapped some of the dust particles, allowing cleaner air to circulate within the stables. The women huddled together, their faces pale and streaked with dirt, their fine silks now covered in a layer of dust. Cybele, her elaborate hairstyle undone, her face devoid of its usual paint and powder, sat huddled in a corner, shivering with fear. The storm, in its indiscriminate fury, had stripped away the veneer of refinement, revealing the vulnerability beneath. Ruqayya moved amongst them, offering water and reassurance, her calm presence a beacon of hope in the midst of the chaos. She had faced sandstorms before, alone in the vast expanse of the desert. She knew that the storm would eventually pass, that the sun would eventually break through the swirling clouds of sand. She just had to keep them safe, to keep them alive until the fury of the desert subsided. The storm raged through the night, its fury slowly subsiding as dawn approached. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the swirling dust, the palace emerged, battered but still standing. The courtyard was covered in a thick layer of sand, the once vibrant gardens now buried beneath a dusty shroud. The harem women, exhausted and shaken, slowly emerged from the stables, blinking. In the unfamiliar light, Cybele, her face pale and drawn, looked around at the devastation, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The storm had stripped away her mask of composure, revealing the fragile woman beneath. Ruqayya, having ensured the safety of the women and animals, returned to the harem to assess the damage. The opulent room, once filled with laughter and chatter, was now silent and covered in a layer of dust. As she surveyed the scene, her gaze fell upon a small, ornate table near Sybil's usual resting place. A silver tea set, normally gleaming brightly, was covered in a thick layer of dust. A single cup, however, remained untouched, its surface clean and gleaming as if it had been recently polished. Ruqayya approached the table, a strange feeling of unease settling in her stomach. She picked up the cup, examining it closely. She noticed a faint residue at the bottom, a thin, almost invisible film. She sniffed it cautiously, and a faint, sickly, sweet aroma reached her nostrils. It was a scent she recognized, a scent she had encountered before in the desert amongst the poisonous plants she knew so well. A sudden realization struck her. She remembered the stories the other servants had shared, the whispers of Sybil's manipulative tactics. She remembered how Idren had seemed weaker, more easily swayed by Sybil's influence in recent weeks. She had attributed it to the stress of leadership, the pressures of the council elders, but now a horrifying truth began to dawn on her. Sybil had been poisoning Idren's tea. The faint residue in the cup, the sickly sweet aroma, the Sheikh's recent weakness, it all pointed to a deliberate act of sabotage. Sybil had been slowly poisoning him, weakening him, making him more reliant on her care and counsel. She had been using her position of trust to manipulate him, to control him, to maintain her hold on his affections. The storm, ironically, had cleared the fog around Sybil's true intentions. The chaos and destruction had stripped away the layers of deceit, revealing the viper beneath the silken robes. Ruqayya's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of anger and fear. She had to tell Idren, had to expose Sybil's treachery before it was too late. She clutched the cup in her hand, the evidence of Sybil's crime, a silent testament to the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the opulent palace. The storm had passed, but a new storm, a storm of truth and consequence, was about to erupt. Ruqayya, clutching the poisoned teacup, strode purposefully towards the courtyard. The Harem women, still recovering from the storm's ordeal, were gathered there, their faces pale and drawn. Sybil, her usual composure regained, was holding court, offering words of comfort and reassurance, her voice smooth and soothing. She saw Ruqayya approach, her eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Ruqayya stopped before Sybil, her gaze unwavering. She held up the teacup, its gleaming surface a stark contrast to the dust and debris that still littered the courtyard. "This cup," she said, her voice clear and strong, "contains the truth about your treachery." A hush fell over the courtyard. The women stared at Ruqayya, their eyes wide with surprise. Sybil's face paled, her carefully applied rouge now a stark mask against her ashen skin. "What are you talking about, girl?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of disdain. "Have you lost your mind?" "I have found my mind," Ruqayya replied, her voice rising with each word. "I have seen through your lies, your manipulations, your poison." She turned to the other women, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "She has been poisoning the Sheikh's tea," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "She has been weakening him, controlling him for her own selfish gain." A gasp rippled through the courtyard. The women murmured amongst themselves, their eyes darting between Ruqayya and Sybil. Sybil, her composure finally cracking, let out a shrill laugh. "Preposterous," she exclaimed. "This girl is mad. She is trying to discredit me, to steal my position." Just then Idren entered the courtyard, his face drawn and tired. He had been inspecting the damage caused by the storm, his heart heavy with the burden of his responsibilities. He saw the commotion. The women gathered around Ruqayya and Sybil, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and fascination. "What is happening here?" he asked, his voice weary. Ruqayya stepped forward, holding up the teacup. "My sheikh," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Sibyl has been poisoning your tea. This cup contains the proof." Idran stared at the cup, then at Sibyl, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He remembered his recent weakness, his increasing reliance on Sibyl's counsel. He had dismissed it as fatigue, as the stress of leadership. But now, Ruqayya's words, combined with the evidence she held in her hand, painted a different picture, a far more sinister picture. Sibyl, seeing the doubt in Idran's eyes, launched into a desperate defense. "It's a lie, my sheikh," she cried. "This girl is jealous. She wants to destroy me. She is making up these accusations to gain your favor." Ruqayya, however, remained calm. She recounted the incidents of sabotage, the whispers she had gathered from the other servants, the evidence she had meticulously collected. She described the faint residue in the cup, the sickly, sweet aroma of poison. Idran listened intently, his gaze fixed on Sibyl. He saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. He remembered Zara's words, her warning about the viper in the garden. He had dismissed it at the time, but now he realized the truth. He had been blinded by Sibyl's charm, by her manipulative tactics. He called for his guards, ordering them to test the residue in the cup. The guards, loyal to their sheikh, quickly carried out his command. They returned moments later, their faces grim. The residue, they confirmed, contained a potent poison, a poison that could slowly weaken and eventually kill. Its victim, Sibyl's face turned ashen. Her lies, her manipulations, her treachery had been exposed. The women of the harem gasped, their eyes wide with horror. They had been deceived, manipulated, used as pawns in Sibyl's game of power. Idran stared at Sibyl, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. He had trusted her, had relied on her, and she had betrayed him, had poisoned him, had endangered his life. The truth, like the desert storm, had swept through the palace, clearing away the dust and debris, revealing the barren landscape of Sibyl's deceit. Idran's voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap. "Sibyl," he said, his gaze unwavering, "you have betrayed my trust, endangered my life, and brought shame upon this palace. For your treachery, you are banished. You will leave this place at once, and never return." Sibyl's face crumpled. The power she had wielded, the influence she had enjoyed, vanished in an instant. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to deny. But no. Words came out. The guards, at Idran's signal, stepped forward and escorted her from the courtyard, her head bowed, her silken robes trailing in the dust. The women of the harem watched in stunned silence as the once powerful head concubine was led away, stripped of her position, her dignity, her freedom. Idran then turned to Ruqayya, his gaze softening. "Ruqayya," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "you have shown great courage and loyalty. You have saved my life, not once, but twice. First, you healed my ailing camel, and now you have exposed the treachery that threatened to destroy me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You have shown me the true meaning of strength, the true meaning of beauty. You have shown me that true worth lies not in silks and jewels, but in honesty, courage, and a pure heart." He raised his voice so that all in the courtyard could hear. "Ruqayya, for your bravery and your loyalty, I grant you your freedom. You are no longer a slave, but a free woman, free to choose your own destiny." A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled women. They had witnessed Ruqayya's quiet strength, her unwavering honesty, her selfless dedication to the well-being of others. They had seen her face the storm, both literal and metaphorical, with courage and grace. They had seen her unveil the viper in their midst, risking her own safety to protect their sheikh. They now looked at her with respect, with admiration, with a new-found sense of gratitude. Ruqayya, her heart swelling with emotion, looked at Idran, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She had faced hardship and betrayal, had endured loneliness and despair, but she had never given up hope. She had trusted her instincts, had followed her heart, and now she stood before her sheikh, a free woman, her dignity restored, her spirit unbroken. The desert had taught her resilience, had taught her to bloom even in the harshest of environments. And now, under the clear desert sky, bathed in the warmth of the morning sun, she felt a new kind of freedom, a freedom that came not from a decree, but from the knowledge that she had earned it, had fought for it, had deserved it. The courtyard, cleared of the sandstorm's debris, was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Idran stood before Ruqayya, his face softened by the gentle light. He took her calloused hands in his own, his touch gentle yet firm. "Ruqayya," he said, his voice low and steady, "I offer you not just my gratitude, but my heart. Will you be my wife?" Ruqayya's heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She had not dared to dream of such a future where she would stand beside the sheikh, not as a slave, but as his equal, his partner, his love. She looked into his eyes, saw the sincerity in his gaze, the depth of his affection. "My sheikh," she replied, her voice soft yet firm, "I accept your offer, but on one condition." Idran raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "And what is that condition?" "I must be free to continue my work with the animals," she said, her gaze steady. "They are a part of me, a part of who I am. I cannot abandon them." Idran smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That is no condition at all, Ruqayya," he said. "Your love for animals is one of the many things I admire about you. You will be free to continue your work, to shape your own destiny. As my wife." Ruqayya's face broke into a radiant smile, a smile as bright as the desert sun. She had found her place, not in the opulent confines of the harem, but in the heart of the man she loved, a man who respected her strength, her independence, her connection to the natural world. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the stable yard, under the open sky, surrounded by the animals they both cherished. The harem women, now free from Sybil's manipulative influence, celebrated with genuine joy, their laughter echoing through the courtyard. Together, Idran and Ruqayya transformed the harem. They established a school where the women could learn to read and write, to develop skills in medicine, agriculture, and animal husbandry. They created a garden where they grew herbs and vegetables, providing fresh produce for the palace. They encouraged the women to share their knowledge and skills, to support and empower each other. The harem, once a place of idleness and intrigue, became a hub of learning and self-sufficiency. The women, no longer confined to their silks and jewels, discovered a new sense of purpose, a new sense of self-worth. They learned to value their own abilities, their own contributions to the community. Laughter filled the harem once more, not the cruel laughter of mockery and disdain, but the genuine laughter of joy and camaraderie. The air, once thick with the scent of perfume and intrigue, now carried the fragrance of herbs and flowers, the scent of life and growth. Idran and Ruqayya, hand in hand, walked through the transformed harem, their hearts filled with love and gratitude. They had faced challenges, had overcome adversity, had found love in the most unexpected of places. They had transformed a place of confinement into a place of empowerment, a place of laughter, a place where love, born in the desert, bloomed and flourished like a rare and precious flower.